Hello everyone, and welcome to this new talk. A few years ago, I told you about the cultural history of three colors: blue, red, and green. The cultural history, that is to say, how mankind, around the world and at different periods, looked at these colors, what their meaning, their symbolism, their status were, as well as how pigments were obtained, be it for dyeing textiles, coloring objects, or for art. Tonight we are going to expand on that by looking at three other colors: yellow, black, and white. In physics terms, in optics, black is not considered a color. It occurs when there is no visible light. It is not a wavelength. White is also sometimes questioned. In physics, it is a color, the combination of all visible wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. But in traditional color theory, it is often not seen as one, because a color in that context has to absorb a specific wavelength. But culturally, and in everyday language, black and white are obviously colors, which is why they deserve to be included. They both are particularly rich in symbolism, actually, but we will delve into this. For now, all you have to do is adopt a comfortable position. We have a long journey around the world and across time ahead of us. Just let me do the work. All you have to do is relax and enjoy the ride. I remind you that if you wish to support this channel and access downloads, early releases, surveys, the same tracks with background sounds, my Patreon page is the place to go. It has dozens of posts such as this one to explore, that will take you to many places, from Earth to space, across time, to explore plenty of historical, scientific, cultural topics, as well as the world of myth and legends. You can join the page and get everything for the monthly payment you deem appropriate, from $1, £1, or €1. And now, let's get started. Our first topic is going to be the color yellow. Yellow exists in nature without being very abundant. We could think of a few flowers or fruits like lemon. There are animals with yellow or yellowish colors, from wasps to tigers. There are landscapes that can be mostly yellow, such as sand deserts, and obviously there is the sun, that can take different hues, but typically yellow is the color that best evokes it. It was also one of the first colors to be used in human art, if we judge by cave paintings. Different shades of yellow were used in painted caves around the world during prehistory. Examples include Blombos Cave in South Africa, dated to 100,000 years ago. Sites in Ethiopia or Australia as well, or European caves like Altamira in Spain or Lascaux in France, which is 17,000 years old. The pigment used to get this color yellow in all of them was yellow ochre. I told you about it talking about all the reds and brownish colors used in cave art. Ochre is a natural pigment that consists primarily of iron oxide, together with other compounds that give it a wide variety of colors. Clay, silica, sand, sometimes traces of other elements like manganese. Yellow ochre ranges from pale yellow to golden or deep yellow, depending on purity and particle size. It was mined from surface or shallow deposits, washed to remove impurities and sand, and then ground into powder. As a paint, its use lasted long after prehistory. Yellow ochre is found on the walls of Egyptian tombs. In Egypt, it served both as paint for murals and cosmetics as makeup. The Romans and the Greeks also used it for wall painting. The Aboriginals in Australia have long used yellow ochre for art on rock or bark, and it was still in use in painting in medieval and Renaissance palettes for frescoes, watercolors, and even to dye textiles. It was cheap, abundant, and reliable because the color almost doesn't fade over time. Nowadays, it has been replaced by synthetic pigments, but some artists still use yellow ochre for its natural origin and natural warmth. It is literally dirt or soil turned into color for art. A less common natural yellow pigment was what is called ore pigment, arsenic sulfide, a compound, a crystal of arsenic and sulfur, which was very appealing as a pigment because it gives a range of vivid yellows, going from orange yellow to lemon yellow. It may look golden with shimmers and was often described as resembling gold. The problem is that arsenic sulfide is highly toxic due to its arsenic content, which can cause poisoning through inhalation, ingestion, or, a bigger problem, skin absorption. And that was a big issue in antiquity, because its toxicity was ignored or looked past, and it served as makeup powder in different cultures around the Mediterranean. The realization that it was dangerous really happened a couple centuries ago, and nowadays it has become very rarely used, mostly for the restoration of old works with their original pigments. It is far less common than yellow ochre. Ore pigment was mostly found either near volcanoes and hydrothermal veins, where concentrated compounds with sulfur surface, or in a few ore deposits. Yet another source of yellow was plant-based, saffron, which may be renewable because it comes from a plant, but was still very sought after and expensive, because collecting it is extremely labor-intensive. So its use from India to the Mediterranean world was limited to royalty or ceremonial uses. Saffron is obtained from the dried stigmas of a flower, Crocus sativus, also called saffron crocus, a plant in the iris family. Each flower produces only 3 stigmas, a tiny quantity. So in order to get 2 pounds or about 1 kilogram of dried saffron, it takes 150,000 flowers that have to be hand-picked and the stigmas delicately harvested. It is believed the harvesting of saffron started in ancient Greece, specifically in Crete. It was found on frescoes and referenced in texts of the Minoan civilization in Crete. From there it spread to Persia, India, and to the west to Rome, and later to Spain, where it was introduced in the 8th century AD. Saffron is also a spice, used in a very small quantity, more for color than taste, and its price remains very high today, often more than $5,000 per kilogram. Why all the effort to produce it then? Because as a pigment, it gives a vivid, luminous yellow-orange hue, and it has a very strong tinting power, even in small amounts. For art, for painting, it was ground into powder and mixed with binders like gum arabic, egg tempera, or oil. Gum arabic, by the way, is a resin that is harvested from certain types of acacia trees. Before synthetic alternatives appeared, it was one of the best, if not the best, binder for pigments, due to its solubility in water. It dissolves easily, and at the same time it has adhesive properties. It holds pigments very well, without cracking, and onto many surfaces, on paper or parchment, on wood, on walls of stone, with or without plaster. It is very stable over time. So that's why gum arabic is found on ancient manuscripts, used to bind pigments in miniatures, in all sorts of paintings, and even in cosmetics. It was used to bind pigments in powders. It made them stick to the skin without cracks. Synthetic binders are available to replace it, but it is still used, and especially nowadays by the food industry, because it is also edible. It is used as a stabilizer in soft drinks, in candy like marshmallows, or in pharmaceuticals to bind drug tablets. And there are more applications, like in adhesives. So returning to pigments, it was historically a binder of choice, even though it had alternatives such as egg white or oil. Apart from saffron, there were cheaper but still good yellow plant-based pigments. One of the earliest and most common, used in particular by the Chinese to dye silk in yellow, was gardenia. The seeds of gardenia yield a clean, bright yellow. Or the bark of cork tree. The inner bark of these trees provides a golden yellow that works particularly well on silk. It was widely used in China, where the color yellow came to be reserved to very high status people. We will come back to this in a minute. There were more sources of yellow pigments in plants, such as pagoda trees or turmeric, a main component of curry that was particularly popular in Southeast Asia. The underground stem and the roots of turmeric give a coloring compound, curcumin, which has a bright yellow hue. The plant is native to India, and it could be cultivated on a relatively large scale, giving an accessible dye, and obviously also spice for human consumption. The color is rather intense. The only downside of turmeric is that as a pigment, its permanence is limited. It fades with light. And on textile fibers, it tends to be washed away, washing after washing. There are mineral dyes, like ochre, that are more permanent. But despite this, turmeric was used extensively for dyeing textiles and painting decoration in India and beyond. It became a popular spice too, and it became culturally important in all of Southeast Asia. So, like for red pigments, you see that early on, a wide variety of pigments appeared around the world that gave options to paint and dye in yellow. I did not mention it because it is not really a pigment, but gold was obviously used too, for ornaments of all kinds. This variety of options for yellow pigments is a reflection of the importance given to this color across ancient cultures. Everywhere it gained a specific meaning and status. Not the same meaning everywhere, but very often yellow was given a high status, something that probably derived from the fact that it is the color of the sun. In ancient Egypt, in art, it was tightly associated with the divine and eternity, as gold was. If you pay attention to how gods are pictured in Egyptian art, their skin is golden yellow, different from the skin of the mortals. Now, in a given culture, a color can have very high status and still be used for more mundane things. I told you yellow was also a color for eye makeup, using ochre, or pigment, the toxic one, or even gold powder. But a place where the status of yellow was considered so important that it ended up being banned for most people was in China. Yellow in China was a color of prosperity, but more importantly, a symbol of royalty and imperial honor. Why did yellow come to be the most prestigious and beautiful color in ancient China? It didn't happen randomly. The status of this color first had philosophical and cosmological foundations. By the end of the second millennium BC, appeared in China the theory of the 5 elements. Actually, 5 elements is a translation from the term wuxing in Chinese. A translation that can be a bit misleading, because it causes confusion with the theory of the 4 elements from ancient Greece. These 4 Greek elements air, fire, water, and earth, were seen as static elements. They were thought to be the components of everything material, combined in different proportions. So, as we are familiar with these four elements, it is sometimes believed that the five Chinese elements are the same concept, just with one more. Air is not one of them. The five Chinese elements are wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. But the point is that these elements, in China, were not seen as static. They were more like five different phases, five processes. They were seen as dynamic and ever-changing forces or energies that flow, generate things, and control one another. And so, wood, fire, earth, metal, and water are phases of these essential forces that constantly transform and were thought to affect more than matter alone. They would have explained the interactions, the cycles, and the relationships of all things in the universe, from natural phenomena to medicine, politics, human affairs in general. For what interests us tonight, the color yellow, this color was symbolically attributed to one of these phases or elements, Earth. And Earth was seen as the central stabilizing force among the five. It represented the concept of balance, nourishment, centering, metaphorically, and also literally as the center of the earth. So the symbolic meaning of yellow, anchored to the element earth, evolved to embody a concept of cosmic centrality, the color around which everything revolves, and that harmoniously binds all things together. Aware of the importance of symbols in politics and power, the first emperors of an unified China, from the 3rd century BC, adopted yellow as their exclusive color. This association of emperors and yellow strengthened under the Han Dynasty, from 206 BC to 220 AD. A rich golden yellow, also called imperial yellow, was reserved strictly for the emperor. It became forbidden to anyone else to wear it. Not all yellows were prohibited. Other hues could still be used, but culturally, people knew that yellow was not a color to mess with. Except for dignitaries and high-status people in general, wearing it became inappropriate for centuries. The traditional robes of emperors were yellow and featured dragons with 5 claws, another imperial symbol. But yellow also extended to the decoration around them. Palaces, temples and altars, or roofs with yellow tiles, these were abundant around the emperors. The restriction of yellow happened in stages. At first it was more of a recommendation. The first restrictions on civilian use emerged during the Tang dynasty. That's the 7th to 10th centuries AD. It weakened after the Tang, at a time of fragmentation of China. But when the country was reunified under the Ming dynasty in the 14th century, strict laws were enforced that prohibited commoners from using yellow. It became very explicit. Aristocrats could still use it, but would not wear the imperial yellow variety. Under their successors, the Qing, the exclusivity of yellow reached its peak. Bright yellow was now forbidden to all, even the most noble members of the court, save for the emperor. Even imperial family members had to use subdued shades that did not shine as much. To some people distinguished for their service to the emperor, a high honor called the Imperial Yellow Jacket could be awarded. It was incredibly prestigious because it signaled proximity to the throne. In practice, it was reserved to select officials or bodyguards. Under the Ming and Qing, violating the yellow restriction could be severely punished. Out of clothing, rules were slightly relaxed, and there are examples of yellow in art. For example, on porcelain pieces from the Ming and Qing periods. But even there, yellow was used to express centrality or sacredness. It was not a color to be used lightly. Of course, since the 20th century and the end of Imperial China, these prohibitions were all lifted, and yellow lost its sacred symbolic charge. But still today, yellow in China evokes prestige, authority, wealth, good luck, stability. Together with red, another color of prosperity, it has a very positive symbolism. Elsewhere around the ancient world, yellow also tended to have a positive aura. In India, where it was obtained from turmeric, as we saw, or for ceremonial and royal garments from saffron, yellow was also a color linked to prosperity in Hindu traditions, to merchants, peace, or knowledge. In Japan, it was a color used to denote positive qualities in painting and textiles, qualities like courage, nobility, or refinement. In various Islamic cultures after the 7th century, it was a color that represented wisdom and enlightenment. Not as positive as green, but it was used in manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, and architecture. At the same time, in America, in native pre-Columbian cultures, yellow seems to have been less invested of meaning, or its symbolism got lost for us. In South and Central America, the use of yellow, obtained from ochre and plants, was very abundant. We can deduce from this that it was a well-liked color, but it doesn't seem to have been invested with a very strong meaning, because it was found everywhere, from mundane artifacts to sacred places. The place and time where yellow became more ambivalent is medieval Europe, and it went on until the 19th century. Yellow could be used in positive contexts, in sacred art, where it served to depict the halos around saints or rays of light. But more often than not, it was given a negative symbolism as a color representing betrayal, cowardice, or deception. Judas would be typically represented wearing yellow robes or a yellow cloak. And over time, especially from the late Middle Ages onward, the color came to be associated with outcasts, like heretics or prostitutes. It seems to have derived from the choice, the convention in art, to paint Judas dressed in yellow. But why such a convention? It is hard to tell and could be a random choice. A possibility is that yellow pigments by the late Middle Ages became more vivid and at the same time very affordable. Their brightness for such a cheap pigment may have contributed to a perception of fakeness. Maybe. Medieval sacred art displayed in churches was not made for a select audience of experts. At a time when most people were illiterate, it was used as visual storytelling to educate about episodes of the Bible, sacred traditions, and to reinforce faith. So conventions in art would not stay confined to a small audience. The symbolic meaning of colors could pass to the entire population over time, which is believed to be a reason for the rise of blue, the color of many stained glass windows in Gothic churches and cathedrals as a very positive color representing royalty and the heavens, as I told you in the episode about blue. So it is unsure how and why it began, but yellow became the color of Judas, a symbol of treachery, greed, and cowardice in Christian tradition, as the disciple who betrayed Jesus. Around the 12th, 13th centuries, it had become a convention around Christendom, at least in Western Europe. And like the veil of Mary had become blue, the robes of Judas were now yellow, a convention everyone could recognize. That's where the often negative aura of yellow came from. And once it had taken root in culture, it stayed for a very long time. And logically, it became the color associated with sinful impulses like greed or envy, a symbol of people who were seen as moving away from good moral values. Renaissance and early modern painters kept using yellow, not only for Judas, which was not such a frequent character in sacred paintings, but to suggest these negative values, or indicate that characters were outcasts, to single them out. In the late Middle Ages, convicted heretics would be dressed with yellow robes. And it is in this context that the infamous practice of forcing the Jews to wear distinctive signs in yellow started. Yellow badges, hats or stars. This began in the 13th century in various parts of Europe, and it evolved to forced markings during some periods. So, as you see, yellow has also a quite sinister history in that case. However, the bad reputation of yellow started to shift again in modern times. It remained used in ambiguous situations, like for warnings, to indicate health hazards, for example, but overall, in Western culture, it returned to a much more positive meaning since the late 18th century, becoming a color of happiness, optimism, and energy. Maybe because the ancient association with the sun made a comeback. Nowadays, in surveys, yellow is not as popular as blue or red, but it is still a relatively well-liked color that a majority of people associate with energy and joy. Now let's move on to our next color, white. Together with black, that's another color with a heavy symbolic charge, maybe more than most other colors. To Westerners, white suggests purity, innocence, peace, cleanliness. On a less positive note, maybe absence or the void. But here again, this is very cultural. In other cultures, white represents death, mourning, or emptiness. So let's see how and why these meanings have evolved. The color white is not too hard to obtain from natural elements. For cave paintings, prehistoric men had two main sources of white pigments. There was shag, which is calcium carbonate, readily available from limestone or shells, and the other one was bone white, calcium phosphate, obtained from bones. Others would join them in antiquity, especially lead white. I will elaborate on this one in a minute. Now, whiteness in fabrics was generally not obtained by dyeing them, but rather bleaching them. Bleaching, that is to say, the chemical process of removing or destroying color from a material to make it whiter. Color is caused by chromophores, molecules that cause color by absorbing and reflecting certain wavelengths. These chromophores can be destroyed or altered, oxidized, by different methods. So bleaching is not adding pigment or dye, it is a subtraction. So what factors cause it, cause bleaching? Some are natural. UV rays in natural light cause it. So do exposure to water and air. It is slow, very slow, but it happens. Humans discovered long ago that chemical agents could speed up the process by targeting color molecules. Agents like alkalis, acids, or oxidizers. In ancient times in Asia and the Middle East, bleaching was entirely done by washing fabrics and exposing them to the sun repeatedly, which made them whiten over time. But it was a very fastidious process, which made perfectly white fabrics valuable fabrics without the natural color of their fibers. Even though cotton or linen or many kinds of wool can have rather clear colors, they're always going to be slightly beige or yellowish or grayish. So this process of washing and exposing them to the air and the sun helped obtain a brighter white. In classical antiquity, it was discovered that the process could be sped up by soaking the fabrics in a solution containing lye, obtained from wood ashes. Lye is a common name for various alkaline solutions, including soda lye, sodium hydroxide, and potash lye, potassium hydroxide. Various soaking and drying sessions helped whiten the fibers, which remained the leading process until the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, an innovation was introduced in the Netherlands. Dutch workshops specialized in advanced bleaching appeared. After their bath of lye, they soaked the fabric in sour milk, which contains lactic acid. This neutralized the corrosive effect of lye and softened fabrics before drying and resuming the cycle. This high-end bleaching still took 6 to 8 months, but that was faster and better than other methods. And because they had this technological edge, the Dutch almost monopolized linen bleaching in Europe. Cloth would be sent to them to bleach it. This process dominated until the 18th century, when the sour milk bath was replaced with diluted sulfuric acid, which shortened the acid treatment by several hours, but it was still very labor-intensive, slow, and it required large bleach fields where cloth was left to dry under the sun. The true revolution was the introduction of chlorine into the process. It led to a solution of potash and chlorine, initially called eau de javel, better known as simply bleach today, and bleaching powder that shortened the process from months to days or even hours. And obviously this was so much faster and efficient than all previous methods that it replaced them. Nowadays, to do it even faster and better, hydrogen peroxide is used. It has the advantage of being gentler than chlorine-based treatments. It also leaves fabrics softer, and to it sometimes optical brighteners are added for even more effect, a whiter than white appearance. In high-end bedsheets or towels, or wedding dresses, this is what makes white particularly bright and appealing. Bleaching was not limited to textiles, by the way. It was also used for paper, and in modern cleaning products, the same chemical concept of removing color and stains via oxidation is also used. I told you that early white pigments for painting included chalk and bone white. To these, a very white but also very toxic compound was added during the Bronze Age, lead white. So what is it? It is a very white pigment containing mainly lead carbonate. Chemically, this is lead, carbon, and oxygen. It can be found naturally, and this is how it was first exploited, starting 5,000 years ago. In the first millennium BC, synthetic lead white began to be produced in China or in Greece by corroding metallic lead with acid, typically with vinegar, in a medium with moisture, and a source of carbon dioxide. The reaction produced lead carbonate, and this was a bit expensive and labor-intensive, but it gave a reliable source of this pigment. Both artists and cosmetic makers liked it a lot, because it gave a warm, creamy white. It held very well mixed with oil. It offered good coverage, it dried fast, and didn't fade or turn yellow. The perfect pigment, almost. And for this reason, it was used as makeup and paint. And this lasted until the 18th century. Of all these masters' paintings you have seen from the Renaissance to the early 19th century, most of them contained lead white. The only downside, and it took a long time to accept it, was its toxicity. Through inhalation of dust or skin absorption over time, lead white caused lead poisoning, which over the long term leads to neurological damage in particular, and other problems. Not that the risk was ignored, it was already pointed in antiquity, but it was downplayed and not considered serious enough to stop using lead. The old medical term for lead poisoning was Saturnism, a term that came from alchemy, because the element lead was associated to the planet Saturn in alchemy. And actually, in medieval and early modern medicine, lead itself was sometimes called Saturn. Saturnism hit hard in ancient Rome, because it went far beyond lead white. The Romans used lead to make plenty of things: pipes, cookware, cosmetics, even directly mixed into wine to sweeten it. And so logically, Saturnism became widespread in ancient Rome. There were even theories in the 20th century saying that lead poisoning could have been the main cause of the decline of the Roman Empire. Most historians take it with a grain of salt. They are cautious with an explanation like this one, because lead poisoning certainly didn't help, but it is not like a majority of Romans ever showed symptoms of Saturnism. So it could well be the kind of lazy one-factor explanation that doesn't really work when you start thinking about it. But still, it was a big public health issue in ancient Rome. So in the 19th century, other pigments finally replaced it completely, especially titanium white. In antiquity, white could be an ambiguous color. On the more positive side, it was linked across many cultures to purity and sacredness. And it sounds logical. Of all colors, it is the clearest one, the easiest to stain. And an immaculate white fabric or object can look precious or fragile just because of that. As we saw before talking about bleaching, it took also a lot of time and effort to obtain a really bright white at the time, which made it even more unique and appealing. So in different African cultures, around the Mediterranean world too, and in the Middle East, as well as in Hinduist and Buddhist traditions, white came to be associated with sacredness. From priests in Greece, in Rome, or in Egypt, to the Muslim pilgrim or the Christian baptized, white signals something sacred, the authority of a priest, the purity of a faithful, or of a bride, the innocence and virtue of the person who wears it. It is also a color of peace, and these meanings are clearly still with us today. In many myths, a white object or animal signals that it is special and even, often, of divine origin. In Celtic and Arthurian legends, there is a white stag, a white deer. Hindu traditions have a white elephant, Airavata, the mount of god Indra. Greek mythology has the winged horse Pegasus, born from Poseidon, the god of the sea and horses, and also a white bull offered by the same Poseidon to the king of Crete, white bull that fathered the Minotaur. In South Africa, there are various legends that feature white lions believed to be gifts from the sun god or spirits of past kings. In the North American Lakota tradition, there's a white buffalo, the sacred symbol of prosperity and spiritual guidance. China had white peacocks, believed to be good omens, announcing peaceful and prosperous times. So white had this almost universal status, indicating something special, pure, divine, and mostly auspicious. Yet, at the same time, it also became a color symbolizing absence, loss, a color of mourning, and not just in Asia. Already in ancient Egypt, white could evoke death, nothing really violent, but the emptiness and silence of death. In Western cultures, black has completely replaced white as the color of mourning. But this happened only in the past few centuries. Before that, the two colors were competing in that context. In Europe, a few centuries back, children would be dressed in white during mourning periods. And when the deceased was dead unmarried, white would be the color to wear for everyone instead of black, to signal purity of the deceased and of the person in grief. Queens during certain periods would also dress in white after the king's death. So it was not as common as black, as the color of mourning, but it competed with it. The perception was that white was appropriate in that context, being at the intersection of purity, sacredness, and on the other hand, emptiness or loss. And nowadays, in much of East Asia, in China, Korea, Japan historically, less today, or in India, or parts of the Middle East, white is the color of funerals. It still carries this sense of purity and virtue, but acknowledging that it can also represent absence. In China, where the tradition of wearing white for funerals is very ancient, we go back to the 5 elements theory that we discussed before when we talked about yellow. I told you yellow was associated with the transformation, the element earth. White was the color of metal, and this gave it associations with autumn, with the west, where the sun sets, and with death. Not the most positive or joyful of connections. And wearing white for funerals to signal grief is a tradition that started 3,000 years ago. In the first millennium BC, it was already established. Rather than pure bright white at the time, more than 2,000 years ago, people would use mourning clothes that were deliberately left in their natural undyed state. So they were whitish rather than perfectly white. And this contrasted with the dyed clothes that would be worn the rest of the time. Here again, signaling a void, a voluntary renouncement to color. What had started as a custom was codified explicitly under the Han Dynasty. We are now around 2,000 years ago. Contrary to imperial yellow, which was a rule associated with imperial China, that was abandoned in the 20th century. Obviously, it was considered a relic of the past to leave behind after the fall of the last emperor, and even more later when China became a communist country. So yellow lost a lot of its status, but white for funerals was a well-established custom that had been popular and traditional for centuries. It was not particularly linked to emperors, and there was no reason to go against it. So the tradition is still widespread today in modern China. Typically, the immediate family of the deceased wears white, or hemp-like garments that look undyed, while others, the extended family, friends, opt for muted colors like dark blue or black. The one color to avoid is red. That signals joy and would be inappropriate. Now, returning to the West, the association of white with brides, wedding dresses, is something that already existed in antiquity. But it was not systematic since then. Many brides would wed in other colors, in the Middle Ages or modern times. White would be a color of choice, but apart from black, which would have been sinister, or yellow, other colors were possible. White dresses made a big comeback in the 19th century, in the bourgeoisie, in Victorian times. Actually, Queen Victoria herself had a white wedding dress. And as the upper classes emulated that color code for weddings, it trickled down quickly in society, to the point that since the 20th century, and probably still today, the majority of brides wear different shades of white. And white is so associated with bridal wear that you don't really see that many white gowns when they are not for weddings, because everyone would think they are wedding dresses. Another shift that happened in the 19th century is also that white became the color of cleanliness. It certainly had this aura of cleanliness before, but now that an entire cleaning products industry existed, perfect white, whiter than white, these have become marketing arguments, promises by washing products manufacturers to their customers. So this association of white fabrics or white surfaces and cleanliness is constantly reaffirmed in advertising. And in the 20th century, it also became a color associated with modernity in home decor and architecture. Inside homes, it is good for light, obviously, but not only. If you sell your home, one of the first things any real estate agent will tell you is that it would be better to paint the walls white, because it is also the color of neutrality. Almost everyone can project their life in a home with white walls. There are certainly trends around it. I remember when I grew up in the 80s, there were many cars with bright colors, but everyone seems to pick black, white, and everything in between these days. Maybe that will change again. But for now, white is the color we can safely default to. The blank canvas that doesn't bother anyone. Let's move on to our third and last color, black. Technically the absence of color. If we start thinking about what black means today, first we may think of mourning, but other facets quickly come to mind. It can also be a color of luxury and elegance, or seriousness and solemnity, black cars, black suits, and paradoxically also the color of rebellion, the main color of the Caribbean pirates' flag, and the color adopted by anarchists and various countercultural movements. In the past, black had even more meanings in some cultures. Meanings like fertility or harmony. So here again, there are things to unpack around this color and its symbolism. Like yellow and white, black was not too hard to obtain as a pigment, starting with charcoal. This was the simplest and the oldest form of black pigments, carbon black, and it was used abundantly in cave art, especially to outline drawings, together with yellow, white, red, and brown. But early on, prehistoric men learned to make better or richer black pigments. They would add to it manganese oxide, which gives black deeper tones. Or they would make what is called bone black. Instead of burning wood for charcoal, they would char animal bones. This yielded deeper black, and this method was used for thousands of years by painters. In Rembrandt's paintings, for example, and Renaissance or 17th century painters that used these deep dark backgrounds, bone black was used for its intensity. It gave a sense of depth, and it mixed well with other pigments, a touch of blue, or red, or green, to introduce variations in the shadows and the background. Another popular black in European art was vine black. Instead of regular wood or bones, this one was made by charring desiccated grapevines and their stems. The difference was that it gave a bluish black hue. And finally, there was lamp black or soot black. In antiquity, a widespread source of lighting was oil lamps, in which oil or animal fat, or more rarely tree resins, were burnt. This left a very dark soot in lamps, a residue that could be used as pigment. Traditional Chinese ink, for example, was made this way. And this ink came, and still comes, in solid form, as sticks that can be diluted simply in water before use. The production method of these ink sticks has not changed much for 2000 years. The basic ingredients is soot or lamp black, which provides the deep black color. Premium versions of this ink use pine soot from burning pine wood, which is rich in resin, always in low oxygen conditions. This gives a matte, slightly bluish tone when diluted, and is considered ideal for calligraphy. More common versions of Chinese ink are made with oil soot. It can be seed oils or petroleum. It doesn't have the matte aspect of pine soot, it is glossier, but also denser, very covering. If you collect soot pigments, they are powder. So in order to bind them and shape them to make sticks, different types of animal glue are used, fish skin, for example, or other animal proteins. On top of holding the soot particles together, the glue gives water resistance to the ink once it is dry. To these ingredients, historical recipes that are still produced for very high-end ink added other things. For fragrance and preservation, there could be herbs or incense. And for special effects, or for the sake of luxury, there could also be jade powder or pearl dust, ground pearls. These ink sticks did not stay confined to China. They spread to Korea or Japan in the first millennium BC, and they are also very traditional there. Nowadays there are modern and cheaper versions that may use synthetic substitutes, but the traditional ink sticks remain prized by artists and calligraphers, and often they are still made by artisans that have perfected and transmitted their know-how for generations. It is hard to tell what meaning prehistoric men associated to black, if any. But in the first civilizations, black was often given a rather positive significance, despite being also the color of darkness, something that could have looked threatening to ancient humans. But it seems that due to black being the color of still water, or in Egypt, of the rich sediments brought each year by the Nile River, black was associated with fertility, or life and rebirth. It was a really positive color for the Egyptians. And light green, another color of rebirth, it was associated with god Osiris. In ancient China, too, black was seen as bringing good fortune and balance. The link between black and death was really created in Greece and Rome. To the Greeks, black was the color of the underworld, and by extension, of mourning. It is documented that since the 6th century BC, the color was worn for funerals and periods of grief. And that was an unusual color to wear for the Greeks. Their clothing would be either undyed, or dyed in earth tones and creams, or plain white. So wearing black was unusual, it was a statement. First because pure and good black dyes that persisted on fabrics were hard or expensive to produce. And on top of that, under Mediterranean climates that are often warm, it is not the best color to wear, as it absorbs heat. So as far as we know from writings and paintings on frescoes or ceramics, black was hardly ever worn out of these grieving situations. And this Greek tradition passed on to the Romans, that developed their own funeral attire in black. In the 2nd century BC, appeared a kind of dark toga that became customary for Roman funerals. So this meaning of black as the color of mourning and funerals is another color tradition that has lived on for more than 2,000 years, since we still live with it across Western countries. But the symbolism of black also diversified in the Middle Ages. On top of the association with death, it also became a color of authority, of solemnity, used by people who wanted or needed to show at the same time authority and humility, restraint. Typically members of the clergy or judges that started to dress in black in medieval times, another custom that went on to our days. Yet another dimension to it is that in the 14th century onward, the upper classes also started to adopt it for everyday wear, because it had become much more appealing visually. Until then, black dyes were not that great, and black clothes would fade relatively quickly with light and washings. In the 14th century, much better dyes appeared, allowing to make good quality black clothes that lasted and were deeper in color. So the elite found it fashionable. Black garments were a perfect backdrop for jewels and touches of color. And as a result, yet another layer of meaning appeared for black. Black as a sign of luxury and elegance. There were ups and downs in that trend. In the 18th century, for example, the aristocratic elite tended to stay away from black, but it remained a color of choice for the wealthy bourgeois, or in European cultures where restraint and discretion were praised. If you look at the portraits of 17th century Dutch men, or the way the Puritans, or more generally men and women of various Protestant denominations at the time, dressed. Black dominates. In periods and places where bright colors are seen as suspicious because they are attention-catching, almost seen as provocative, black generally dominates as the go-to color, a way of signaling one's virtue or of not standing out. In the 19th century, it was embraced by businessmen, the European high bourgeoisie in general, still connecting with the same meanings that had been around for several centuries: seriousness, modesty, authority, restraint, and also luxury, as much as red was the color of royalty until blue replaced it. Black became the color of quiet luxury, quiet wealth. Still, as always with colors and social trends in general, maybe, there is always a bit of ambiguity on the side. Black also maintained in parallel a darker meaning. It was the dress code of the clergy, but also connoted witches and evil in general. The ancient association with darkness and the night never entirely disappeared. And maybe for the same reason, while remaining in the 20th century a major color in fashion, art, a symbol of modernity, it retained a little subversive dimension. It was claimed by anarchists, and it seems to be appealing to people who see themselves or want to project their image as outcasts. Not just anarchists, hard rockers or moody teenagers are drawn to black too. And that's paradoxical given how institutional black also is at the same time. This is the end of our historical and cultural journey for tonight. If you are not sleepy yet, you may pick another story in my library and embark on a new adventure. Or you may keep your eyes shut, let go, and fall asleep. I'll be back soon with another story. And in the meantime, sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.